Ciao everyone, today we're going to talk about drum triggering, or the way I like to call it, drum sample layering. So the practice of using drum sample, it's been around since the 80s, and it's been a technique that has been misunderstood, misused, but yet nowadays heavily used, especially in genres such as pop, punk rock, rock, metal, and so forth. Now, before we start diving into what drum replacement is, I would love to share with you a little bit my thoughts about it. So, drum replacement, already the word drum replacement involves replacing a performance, which is not what I want to do, nor what I'm about to teach you. Because if you think about it, we're not replacing a performance. I mean, think about the time that an engineer takes to choose the microphone, position, so rightfully so, the mics, tuning the drums. The drummer has his own way of playing drums, signal flow, the console that all the signals are going to be fed to. And then a mix engineer will scratch all of that and replace that within a matter of minutes with perfectly sampled drums that have nothing to do with the original sound. So this is not what I'm aiming to do. That's why my technique, or the technique that actually it's implied this tutorial, involves drum sample layering. In other words, I don't want to replace a drum performance, but perhaps enhance it using samples in order to, bring up a little bit more forward the overall tone of a performance. So again, I'm not going to be replacing drums. Yes, I will be using triggers, but to enhance a performance. So why do we use samples, or why do we start sampling drum layers underneath a performance? For reasons. Now, the first reason has to do with the freedom of working with the sample without being constrained of EQing a snare drum that might sound differently because the drummer might be a little bit inconsistent with it. Therefore, I have a total freedom over the sample. That means that I could use the sample to trigger perhaps reverb's returns. I could use the sample perhaps to control the overall dynamic, so I can compress the sample in a certain manner, and so forth. The second reason why I would want to use samples is to compensate for missing timbre components. So let's say I'm working with a great sounding, drummer, but perhaps the recording we've used, it's lacking a little bit. The timbre of the instrument might needs something that EQ will never be able to give us, something that compression, expansion, or parallel compression is never going to be able to give us. Therefore, what I want to do is to compensate the sound of my original sound with a sample. In other words, I'm playing this virtual Tetris with the sonic characteristic of this instrument, and by adding a sample, that sample will be used only to compensate for problematic areas in the overall timbre of that instrument. Third reason why we're using samples? Well, pretty easy. Samples are spill free. In other words, I'm not going to run into any problems, let's say again a snare drum, of having a lot of hi-hat bleeding within my snare mic. Therefore, I could use the sample, as I told you before, in order to trigger a reverb. So I can imprint an overall tonal balance of virtual room within my reverb to my snare drum, but the snare that will trigger the reverb will be my sample. Fourth and last reason why we're using samples is to have a little bit more control over the dynamic of the performance. In other words, right now I'm going to have perfectly sampled tracks, which I can then later on automate however I want in order to imprint even more dynamic to the overall sound of my drums. So now, without any further ado, I would love to jump inside Pro Tools and show you what I'm talking about. Alright, as you can see here, I have already prepared a little sneak peek of a drum performance from a band that I recorded a couple years ago. And I'm going to give you just a little preview of how the drum sounds. So you got the point. The drums doesn't sound necessarily bad, but we could tail a little bit a couple of sounds. Let's focus on the sound of my snare drum. All right, so I'm gonna let you hear the snare from this part onward. Focus on this last couple of notes compared to the previous ones. So I'm gonna let you hear these two snare drums over here. Do you notice that the timbre of the instrument changes because perhaps maybe the drummer has played a little bit differently, and depending on how hard he plays the snare drum, where his drumstick hits, whether the center of the snare drum, a little bit on the side, and if he plays again against the rim shot, will greatly vary the timbre and the impact and the sound of the snare drum. So again, I'm going to let you hear these two snare drums over here and these last two. Focus on the tail of the decay of the snare. Actually, what I could do, I can separate my timeline from edit selection, so that right now I will have two different playbacks. If you're interested on this trick, there is a video about it. So right now I can press O. Actually, right now I can press left square bracket to play the edit selection, and the right square bracket to play the timeline selection. Again, focus on the timbre of the two. So I'm going to let you hear the first snare, second snare, first, you hear that the two different types of timbres are completely different. So this is a great, occasion for us to use drum sample layering in order to compensate and create a little bit more of a uniform sound for our snare drum. I'm going to press 0 to remarry the timeline and edit selection and relink the two. I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit of the kick drum to see if we are running into the same problem. So again, the kick drum doesn't necessarily sound bad, but there are some areas, especially in the low end, that could be sculpted a little bit more, and we could use some samples in order to imprint a little bit more attack. And I'm saying this primarily because I want to hear them a little bit more in context when we're going to be playing them with our overhead. So listen how much we're going to start losing focus on kick and snare once the overheads are in. So as you can understand right now, we need to figure out a solution in order to imprint a little bit more glue and tonal balance to our drums. And I want to start with the snare drum. Now, the first technique I'm about to teach you, it's one of my favorite techniques in order to layer samples underneath a performance. It's a little bit tedious, but I can promise you that on a long run is a technique that is going to offer the best results. So the first thing I'm going to do is to duplicate my snare drum, Shift Option D, and I want this only to follow my active playlist. So just for reference, I'm going to color code this in a different color so we know that this is our duplicated. All right. So just to show you before I move forward that the drums have been slightly EQ'd. There's not a lot of processing, just a little bit of carving frequencies and removing unwanted frequencies and just putting drums a little bit more in context. So nothing special. So here's what I'm going to do. The first thing I'm going to do is to create a brand new track. This is going to be my snare trigger. And I want the snare trigger mono and a stereo. With the mono, we'll compensate the overall tonal balance of the snare based on the direct mic. And with the stereo sample instead, I will add a little bit more depth and presence on the snare that feeds the room tracks. So I'm going to go ahead and create a stereo sample, still on audio track. This is going to be my snare trigger stereo. All right, first and foremost, we color code our tracks, always. And the colors for my snare samples are always this kind of dark red. Actually, let's choose this one over here. Yep, there you are. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is to access my volume workspace. Here I have a catalog that I've already previously created with some of my favorite drum samples. And over here I can go here, for instance, catalog with samples is something that you might want to build. And it comes every time you work on a project, every time you get to mix something and you start liking the outcome of a sound, in this case of snare, percussion, anything you like. I start collecting them so that later on I could use them for different productions. For instance, here I have a Deer sample. Deer is actually the initial name of a band I worked on a couple of years ago, the Dirhams, phenomenal band from Dubai. I highly encourage you to go and listen to them on Spotify. So over here, I have a couple of samples and I have my snare mono, snare stereo. So right now what I could do is to select one, and by selecting them, I will automatically play the snare. A little bit too loud, let me lower that. And of course, right now we have different types of rooms. As you can see over here, I have mixed in a certain way and bounced down different microphones. Nice. I definitely like this overall snare mic. Let me hear in context. Yeah, this is gonna work. So I'm gonna hold on Option and drag it into my stereo track completely randomly. Now let's go ahead and see if I have other interesting sounds. Maybe a little bit too aggressive for this song. Let's see what I got here. So Shift Option, I can hide the workspace browser. Option J, I can bring this back. And I actually like this snare fat. So I'm gonna hold on Option and drag it. All right, so I will re-hide my workspace browser. And what I wanna do, I'm gonna put myself into grid mode, is making sure that both these samples are starting at the same time. And as you can see right now already, this sample, actually the room, starts a little bit late. So I want to, that was my fault actually when I cut the sample. So I want to trim it and then make sure that the two samples are phase aligned. Let me see, I could do a little bit better than that. All right, these seem good. The second thing I want to do is, and this is part of the trick that I'm about to teach you, is you want to consolidate the two clips and have them at least a bar long. I will tell you later why. So right now I'm gonna Shift Option 3 and consolidate the samples. The first thing I want to do is to check the phase polarity between these two samples. So to do so, I'm gonna open my trusty little labs and just flip the phase. And I want to see if they are perfectly in phase one with another, or if by flipping the phase I will gain a little bit more depth from it. I will just, for the time being, lower them the clip gain just so they don't blow out of your speakers. Gonna make a smaller selection. Yeah, now they're definitely in phase one with another. All right, so here's the cool part. In order to apply manual triggering or manual drum sample layering, you want to make sure that the two triggers or samples are always on top of the snare drum that you are about to layer sample underneath. And I'm going to review why in a little bit. Now over here we have our sample snare, and what I want to do for now is Command 8, bring up my beat detective. I'm going to go in my clip separation. The first thing I want to do is to make sure that the grid resolution matches with your performance. And right now, as you can see, I'm using Option Control plus and minus to increase or decrease the grid resolution. And right now we're certainly working with 8 notes. So you want to make sure the beat detective captures 8 notes performance. All right, so right now we got our selection in 8 notes from bar 1 to bar 15 beats 4. And as a matter of fact, we do. So the next thing I want to do is to go to normal analysis, low resolution, analyze. As you can see right now, Beat Detective has analyzed all my snare hits. And right now, if I go and show trigger, next, 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 next. Actually, hold on, Option and remove that. I could actually lower the sensitivity a little bit. We can remove this because we don't need it. All right. So as you can see, Beat Detective has done his job right. So now the next step will involve making sure that the trigger pad is at 0, because you don't want to add any time before the cut, and separate that. Command 8 and we're done. So right now we have created different, or actually multiple clips based on exactly our transients. So here's where the trick comes in place. Pro Tools, it's capable of storing within a cut and copy buffer a copy of whatever you are storing it. And every time you want to paste something, he will remember where those clips were. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select my 2 triggers. Also, go back. Select my 2 triggers, X to cut, and again, they're stored into my buffer, right? So if I press V and select only one track, only one of the 2 sample will come back. I select 2 tracks, press V to paste, and they're back. So right now I want to create a group, right? nothing is in my trigger tracks, and I have, of course, my duplicated snare. So I will select these 3 tracks, Command G, and this is going to be to delete group. It's going to be an edit group. I will get rid of it as soon as I'm done with this. Create, click OK. And right now, as you can see, every time I select something, the selection will involve all the elements of this group. Now, the great feature about Pro Tools, as I was telling you before, is that even though we have grouped something together, and I'm going to show you here where nothing is here, if now I press V, as you can see, I haven't pasted anything on top of the performance, but Pro Tools remember where these 2 samples were located, and from the buffer of the cut, copy, and paste, he positioned those samples exactly where they were. Z to undo. So right now, I could use another feature, which is tab to transient. So tab to transient works in the exact same way. Every time we have a transient and we press tab, it will position the cursor exactly at the beginning of the transient. But if we deactivated it, Option Command Tab, right now the tab to transients becomes a tab to clip. In other words, I can here press tab, I'm at the end of the clip, press L to tab back. When I have multiple clips and I press tab, as you can see, my cursor snaps at the beginning of each single clip. So with that said, if I now press V, I have pasted my sample exactly at the beginning of my transient. Remember when I told you to have a long enough selection? So right now if I press tab, the first clip that it will encounter, the tab to transient within our overall group, is our sample snare. V, and I paste it. Tab, V, tab, V, tab, V, tab, V. It's a little bit of a long process, but if done properly, you're going to have a great result. So, before moving forward, I just want to check one thing. Just want to make sure that whatever we have here is perfectly in phase, which in fact it is. It happens sometimes, and it feels good. So right now what I can do is to easily go to my groups down here and delete this group as I do not need it. Go to my snare top, duplicate, and delete that as well. And the last thing I generally do is to shift return, semicolon, group these clips. So I don't want to see all this cuts across the clips, so I can create a clip group, Option Command G. So right now they move as a one block. I still can Option Command U or Option Command G, not Shift, sorry, and group them together. And right now I could mix and match the 2 performances. So I'm gonna go ahead and let you hear the drums without the samples, and then I will blend in the samples. Maybe just a little bit too much. So I'm going to start by blending in only the snare trigger mono for now. I'm going to select my dynamic transport. Again, I've found a good balance for my snare trigger. And listen to the difference that this snare does when playing context with the drums. So right now it's completely lifeless. In context, So you might wonder why I have added a stereo sample. So right now, the mono sample is actually compensating a little bit more for the lack of presence that the direct microphone has it. And now the stereo sample instead, I want to blend it in with the room and the overheads. Because as a matter of fact, when we listen to those microphones, there is always a little bit of lack of definition of the snare drum. So I want to imprint a little bit more depth to the snare through the room and the ambience microphone. Again, without the sample. Listen how the snare drum just loses a lot of depth and definition. So I will play you now the whole drum kit without samples and then with the 2 samples added in. Just to give you an idea of how the snare top sounds. Do you hear the grit that we're getting? Do you hear the roundness and the companion from the overall timbre of the snare that we're getting with it? Now what I'm gonna do is play you only the 2 samples together to let you hear how weird they are, so to speak, in solo. So they're very detached, very artificial. And that's the point. We might want to add something that sounds a little bit more artifact, but in context, I hope you were able to hear how they made the difference. So I'm going to do the exact same thing for my kick drum. And to do so, I will listen back to the kick drum and see the areas that the kick drum is lacking in and apply the exact same thing. Okay, it's a little bit too wibbly. So I'm gonna create one mono track, and this is gonna be my kick trigger. Again, I will move this track up. Color code it the exact same way as my snare drum is. Bring up my sample library and let's see what we got here. Too aggressive. Again, there needs to be a lot of research done in terms of what type of kick drum to select, because it's crucial for you to choose the right sample. So it's not just a matter of layering underneath a performance whatever sample. You need to make sure that the overall timbre of that sample works with a lot of synergy with the overall sound of the instrument. So I'm gonna actually go in my volumes, music, sample trigger, trigger drums. And as you can see here, I have a much greater sample library. So let's see what can we get from here. Let's go on trigger Matteo, which are my triggers. Let's see. Pearl sample. Like this sample that has a little bit of room in it, so it's not super dry. Let's go with a maple just to give it a listen. Yeah, this is a little bit closer. So option, click, and drag. So it's a stereo file. So what I'm going to do, simply get rid of the other half. Nice. Has a lot of presence, a lot of depth, a little bit more of room tone, since it was a room sample. So I will bring it down there. Let me just make sure it's in phase. I'll check it in a little bit. Actually, I can check it right now. So the samples, as you can see over here, is certainly not in phase. So I will reactivate my tab to transient. Tab. All right. Control and click. So they snap perfectly together, and they're absolutely out of phase. So instead of using any plugin, I'm going to go into my audio suite, choose invert, render, and now we have something a little bit more in phase. Again, option, command, sorry, shift option D to duplicate a track. I will make this track of a color that I wouldn't use for my kick drum. What you want to do again is control option plus and minus just to make sure you're on the right grid. You could do the exact same thing from here, but we prefer to use shortcuts, right? So 8th note, command 8. I have my bit detective on. I want to make sure we are in 8th note, capture the selection. We're on low emphasis and analyze. So as you can see here, bit detective, has left some of these hits out its analysis. So we want to raise the sensitivity in order to make sure that all the hits have been taken under consideration from beat detective. And even though we have this sort of like ghost notes, we want them to be triggered. Yes, everything seems in order. But this guy over here, I think I spotted something different. No. All right. So right now, what we want to do is to separate this. Close bit detective. You want to group the two things. Command G. Again, to delete, exclamation mark, so we remember that we want to delete that. And right now the two tracks have been grouped together, as you can see. I will shift command G, suspend the group for a minute, because the trick is to put the samples on top of the track we want to replace. Cut it, shift command G, re-engage the group. And right now what we want to do is command option tab to disengage tab to transient, tab, and we are on the first hit, V, tab, V. We're missing only one over here. And to do so, what I'm going to do is just to re-engage, tab to transient, tab, V, oops. And apparently I have to redo this last few. All right, tab, V, tab, V. All right, so right now I can actually get rid of the duplicated track. We don't need that anymore. I can get rid of my group. And the last thing I want to do is to, again, Option Command G, group my sample, and possibly lower that a little bit. All right, let's see how the original kick sounds. Sample. So the two sounds are, you know, one is a little bit more natural, the other one is a little bit more aggressive. So what I want to do right now is to actually blend in the sample against the original sound. So what I'm going to do right now is just play you with and without the samples. Listen how the overall performance changes. So the samples are now muted. So by now you should be able to hear how much this drum sample layering has actually helped even more to sculpt the sound of our drums. We could do something even further right now. So I told you before we had a little bit more control over the timbre, check. We have a little bit of control over the dynamic, check. And the last thing I want to do is perhaps to add a little bit of reverb, right? So instead of having this constant hi-hat feeding the reverb, right now I could actually use my sample, or even more, my rooms. And I'm gonna go ahead and create my snare verb. So actually I'm gonna go ahead and choose a reverb. I'm gonna go and 480. I'm gonna go ahead and choose plate rooms. And I'm gonna load up. Let's go with some small wood room. Let's see how this sounds. Okay, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead and in context. So now that you have heard the difference, I'm gonna start letting you hear the drums before without reverb, and then I'm going to remove the samples. All right. So now this is the overall kit, drums with reverb and the 3 triggers, and then I will remove them. I'm going to let you hear only the triggers. So as you can understand, the triggers by themselves do sound very gimmicky, very artifacts. But this is the goal here. We want to use other elements that will compensate for the overall lack of timbre. And as you can see right now, and here especially right now, if I play only the 3 elements by themselves with reverb, they still sound very unnatural. But the magic happens when you blend them in with the overall performance. So again, I'm going to let you hear the overall performance, and then I will remove the triggers and remove the effect. And there you have it. So now you have understood how properly work with drum sample replacement, and as well make the samples work for your performance. Again, this is just scratching the surface, because there's so much more that we could do in terms of automating things, using a little bit of tape saturation in order to make the samples even, bigger, fatter, warmer. But the scope of this lesson is just really to teach you how to use samples in a very natural way. All right, so right now we have seen how we could easily stack different layers of samples manually underneath our drums. But that's not the only way to do things in this field. There are many different ways. That is, to me, the most reliable one and the most precise. But there are as well plugins that can help you out to speed up the process, and especially in and with different performances, we might be able to achieve greater results. It's always depending on what is that we need to do. So right now we have a completely different performance. The sound of the drums is actually a little bit more aggressive, and we are lacking just in a little bit of definition of some of the elements, especially when we're dealing about our 3rd dimension. So rooms and overheads. I'm gonna let you hear how this drum performance sounds to then explain how can we enhance the performance with a plugin. So the overall drum sounds really good, massive, punchy, big, but perhaps I think that in some part of this performance, especially when the snare drum plays a lot of ghost notes, such as in this part, these ghost notes are perhaps lost within our overheads and room microphones. They might need a little bit more definition. So different companies created across the years different trigger plugins. My favorite of all times, it's called Trigger by a company called Slate Digital. And I think that the way that plugin works and its internal architecture, it's extremely versatile and extremely useful to do what we're about to do. Now, before moving in understanding how Trigger works, I'm going to show you how not to use Trigger, which is a mistake that I've seen done by a lot of people. So what a lot of people would do would be to simply duplicate the original snare drum. And on top of that, the duplicated snare drum, they will insert an instance of Trigger, mono or stereo. Actually, right now I want to enhance more the room, so I'm gonna go with mono to stereo. Browse in their library. And again, you could stock samples however you want. Right now, I'm just gonna choose a library that comes with the plugin. I'm gonna go with Black Beauty Open. And as you can see right now, down here we have the ability to stock different samples. Direct mic, overhead, and 2 different flavors of rooms. So by doing so, the job is pretty much done, but it's the wrong job. In context, so far so good. If it wasn't that, what we want to do with this track is to kind of like bring up all this nice ghost notes that our drummer is doing. See, right now we don't hear anything. I'm gonna just reduce the blend. So this, I want to be able to hear it. And in order to do so, I'll have to mess around with my sensitivity, retrigger, and detail, which is sort of like threshold, which tells triggers when to play the sample. Now, in order to pick up such a small amount of details, I have to lower down my detail as much as I can and increase my sensitivity as much as I can. And this will produce this problem. Original performance. Of course, we're listening only from one side because this is a stereo, but you get the point. Actually, let me do this by messing around with the mix knob. So original, trigger. Definitely not what we want to do. So if it's just a simple matter of figuring out super quick what to sample use underneath a performance, this might work. But if you're aiming to work with the level of details that this plugin would allow you to do, we need to use the proper manner. So I'm gonna get rid of my snare duplicate, and we're back at square one. So the first thing I'm gonna do is to move into my mix window, and I'm gonna go ahead and create a new stereo aux track. It's gonna be called Trigger Snare. All right. I'm gonna go into my insert, select my trigger, and there we have it. Now, this is the initial window or software that works with Trigger. So from here, as you can see, you have a mixer that would allow you to stock different samples across different inserts, and you can blend the volume of the sample, tune them, detune them, and as well play with the phase. So already by default, you can do the same thing we did before within one plugin. Then you have a browser that would allow you to relink everything that you have within your drum sample folder, if you have one, and some sample that comes already with the software. I'm gonna go ahead and choose the Black Beauty Open, as I liked it before, and as I think it does a pretty good job of what we need to do. But that said, I could add any samples I want, so the software is pretty great. So right now, again, we have a direct sound, an overhead mic, room, and a darker room. So after you've browsed anything that you want to use as a trigger, what you want to do is go back into the triggering default page. So here how it works. In order for you to properly tell trigger what to trigger and what to not to trigger, so the kick drum and unwanted sounds, trigger works with a very interesting and intricate sidechain components underneath the layers. And this is how it works. So on the aux track, where you're going to be instantiating trigger, you want to select the bus. And I'm going to go ahead and choose an available bus. Bus 1 and 2 will do. Now, you always have to think source to destination. What is my source? My source is my snare drum. My destination is my trigger. Okay, so I want to link the two of them. But trigger offers you another layer of sidechaining. A sidechain that is strictly related to this parameter called suppress. In other words, you could tell the sidechaining of trigger what to suppress. So he will analyze the program material, and based on from where the program material will be fed to the software, will suppress or let you hear the sound. So in this case, bus 1 and 2, bus 1 is the leading one, is the sound that I want to replace. So, or layer. So I'm going to go on my snare drum, bus, and I'm going to choose bus 1. What is the sound that I want to avoid of all cost? Well, in this case is my kick drum. So my kick drum will be sending a copy out of bus 2. Option click, bring the faders at Unity, bring them into pre-fader. And so right now, look what happened. Look what happened, especially if I increase the suppress knob. I'm gonna let you hear only the trigger. You see all these little blue hits? The louder one, those are probably our kick drum. Matter of fact, if I play the kick, so since I want to be able to grab the smallest details of my snare drum, I need to work with my 3 parameters, my sensitivity, which is, the word implies how sensitive the software will be at different level changes, and my details. That means that I have to go very low, and I want to avoid the software to mistrigger the kick. So by using bus 1 and 2, where bus is sending the instrument that needs to be triggered, and bus 2 is sending everything that I want to suppress, I could increase my suppress knob. And as you're going to see, let's do 96%. Let's do 90%. Every time I play right now, you're going to see blue lines that corresponds to the instrument we want to trigger, and everything in red is everything that the trigger sidechain is suppressing. So now we could see the ghost notes and the kick drum. As a matter of fact, if I open up the kick drum, every red note corresponds to whenever the kick drum is playing. So right now we could actually figure it out where the ghost notes are. But before doing so, I'm gonna let you hear something interesting. Look what happened if I bypass trigger. So this is how the buses have been rewired inside the sidechain of trigger. So kick and snare. So the left signal will trigger the sound of the snare. The right signal will be suppressed. All right, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead and select a part where I know I have some ghost notes, probably this part over here. Let me mute for a second trigger. Here, there you go. So in this case, I'm gonna start using my detail, which is a sort of like threshold that Trigger uses to detect when to trigger foreground material. And I'm gonna put the threshold really low. So we're there. As you can see here, we are in the range of where our ghost notes are. But what I want to do right now is increase a little bit more the sensitivity so that Trigger reacts really promptly to the sounds that will be fed up. And of course, I want to play with the retrigger time, which is how long it's going to take Trigger to retrigger a note after the previous note has been triggered. You see how right now we are triggering even the softest notes? Let's play a longer section. All right, so right now I can do something more. Right now we are viewing the mixer view, but I could go within my view curves and I can actually play with the attack, sustain, and release, and as well with my velocity and dynamic. So as you can hear right now, we are triggering everything, and we can as well imprint a little bit of dynamics to the overall sound. So if right now I move into my edit window, actually mix window, and let you hear only the rooms. So right now I'm gonna let you hear only the overheads, room, and room microphone with trigger, and I will blend them in. With your old drum. And there you have it. So now you can use triggers. You could use samples, but only to compensate for perhaps maybe the lack of timbre that an instrument might have. Triggers should be understood as a fine art to really researching underneath your library what are the best samples that works for your performance. You don't want to replace a performance unless the performance is being terribly compromised because poorly recorded, poorly played, or maybe for any other reason. So I hope now you have a clear understanding of how to use triggers. You have a clear understanding of how to use samples and how great it is having this extra layer of controls for your drums. Until the next lesson, ciao.